All right, welcome everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the next event in our speaker series for the 2024-25 academic year and our first event for 2025. My name is David Glasgow. I'm the Executive Director of the Meltzer Center for Diversity, Inclusion and Belonging here at NYU Law. And for this event, I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished guest, Dr. Jamil Zaki. Dr. Zaki is a professor of psychology at Stanford University and the director of the Stanford Social Neuroscience Lab. He received his BA in cognitive neuroscience from Boston University and his PhD in psychology from Columbia University. In 2019, Dr. Zaki was awarded the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, the US government's highest honor for researchers at his career stage. He's written about human connection for multiple outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and many more. And he's the author of the book, The War for Kindness, Building Empathy in a Fractured World. And then most recently, for the purpose of today's conversation, his wonderful book, Hope for Cynics, The Surprising Science of Human Goodness. Just by joining us for this event, you've been automatically entered into a raffle to receive a copy of Dr. Zaki's excellent book, and you'll find out later if you've been selected in that raffle. Toward the end of today's program, I'm going to open it up as we always do for audience Q&A. So as we're having the conversation today, please submit any questions that you have using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. So with that, welcome, Jamil. It's great to have you as part of the series.
Thanks, David. I'm thrilled to be here. And thanks, everybody, for joining. As David said, there'll be time for questions. And I really hope you all feel utterly welcome to share your reactions and anything that's on your mind.
Great, so let's get started. Your book, Hope for Cynics, is about cynicism. And so just to start with some definitions, how do you define that term, cynicism?
Yeah, so I need to separate the definition of cynicism that psychologists use today from the ancient Greek school of philosophy. There was a version of cynicism 2,500 years ago that was a sort of philosophical school. But now the way that psychologists define cynicism and scientists define it is as a theory about people. The idea that in general, humanity is selfish, greedy, and dishonest. Now, a cynic might not deny that people could do something that was kind or friendly or positive, but they might think about that person's motives through a suspicious lens. They might say, yeah, they donated to charity, but it was to get a tax break. Yes, they helped a stranger, but it was to look good in front of other people, right? So cynicism is not a theory about what we do, but it's a theory about who we are. And it's one that makes it much harder to trust other people or build community with them as well.
Great. And so you mentioned trust, and your book talks about how when trust goes down in a society, cynicism goes up. So there seems to be a very close relationship between mistrust and cynicism. And you talk about how we're not exactly living in high trust times. So over the past several decades, Americans' trust has gone down in the presidency, newspapers, Congress, public schools, and even in one another as fellow citizens. So I'm curious, what in your view has caused that downward shift in trust? Because it seems to be something that hasn't occurred just over the last couple of polarizing electoral cycles, but is something that's really occurred over a period of several decades.
That's right. I would say that the data suggests that the slide in trust has been going on for at least the last 5 decades, since the late middle of the 20th century through to now. So, for instance, in the 1970s, about half of Americans believed that most people can be trusted, but by 2018, that had fallen to a third of Americans. That's a drop as big in terms of humanity's faith in each other. It's a drop as big as the stock market took during the financial collapse of 2008. And at the same time, as we've lost trust in our fellow human beings, we've lost even more trust in all manner of institutions. You mentioned government and the presidency and education, but we've also lost trust in medicine, in science, in media, in industry. I mean, we're really living in a deep trust deficit, which is hurting us in a lot of ways that I'm happy to talk about later. But David, you asked about the cause for this, and that's a vexing question, right? So it turns out that history is not an experiment, right? So you can't, just because two things coincide in time, decide that one caused another. That said, there are correlations between mistrust and cynicism, right? Those two things, and a bunch of other features of our lives. For instance, inequality is one really strong correlate of mistrust. In more unequal nations, states, and towns, people trust each other less. So there's a relationship across space. And as particular states and nations become more unequal, trust declines in those places. So it seems as though when people feel as though resources are distributed in an unfair way, that a small number of people have a grasp on really so much wealth, that makes it harder for people to feel aligned with one another. The other thing that I think we can point to, although not conclusively, is the rise of certain forms of media, things like cable news and social media. There's something known as mean world syndrome. The idea is that the more you tune in to cable news and social media, the worse you think people are. And you might say, well, yeah, that's because you're more informed and people are really terrible. But it turns out that folks who watch a lot of cable news, for instance, are actually systematically wrong about things that frighten them and the people who they don't like. So in some ways, media is the opposite of education and is driving, instead of us being more knowledgeable about each other, driving greater cynicism in each other.
Great, that's really helpful. And I want to, pick up really both of those threads later in this conversation, the one about inequality and then also the one about the role of media and social media. But before I do that, I'd love to tackle some of these myths that you discuss in the book that glamorize cynicism, because I suspect even many of the people tuning in today might, think of themselves as cynics, whether they're proud of that fact or not. And so I want to do a little bit of that myth busting with you, and you identify really three major myths about cynicism. The first one is the myth that cynicism is clever. So can you say a little bit about what that means to say that the myth of cynicism is clever, and why is that wrong?
Yeah, so since publishing Hope for Cynics, I've received somewhere between dozens and hundreds of emails from self-proclaimed cynics. Some of them say, wow, this has been really helpful to me, but others say, you know what, I'm proud of being a cynic. Maybe it doesn't feel great to think the worst about people, but I'm just too smart to think anything else. I've been around the block too many times. There's this stereotype that many of us have that cynicism is a sort of wisdom, that if you trust people, if you believe in them, that's because you're naive and eventually you will be taken advantage of. And so researchers have studied this. They've presented people with a story of one person who's very cynical and doesn't trust anybody, and another person who's relatively trusting and open-minded. And they'll ask participants, which of these two people do you think would do better on a series of different tasks? And what they find is that 70% of people believe that cynics will outperform non-cynics on cognitive tasks, that they're smarter, basically. 85% of people believe that cynics are socially smarter, that they would be able to tell who's lying and who's telling the truth more than a person who's trusting. So we call this the cynical genius illusion because it is completely backwards. It turns out that cynics actually do less well on cognitive tests than non-cynics, and they're worse at spotting liars. Now, why would that be? Well, it turns out that if you're cynical, you might not have faith in people, but you have tons of faith in your assumptions, right? You think that you already know what people are like, and you just look for evidence that confirms your bleak hypothesis, and you ignore anything else, which is maybe a good way to argue, but a terrible way to learn about the world. So cynicism, in a way, is a form of naivete, a form of assumption masquerading as a form of social intelligence or wisdom.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I wonder, it reminds me a little bit of, the philosopher Hannah Arendt draws a connection between cynicism and gullibility. And I wonder if there's a kind of sense in which we have to place our trust somewhere, right? So to your point, even if you're mistrustful of all these mainstream sources of information, for example, or institutions, ultimately you might fall prey to, trusting unhelpful sources of information or trusting your own sort of gut instincts, even if they're quite misguided.
You know, this is a really good point, and there's some evidence that came out recently that more cynical people are actually more susceptible to conspiracy theories, for instance, right? Because if you believe in your heart of hearts that something is wrong, that humanity is fundamentally broken, well, a conspiracy theorist might give you an argument. They might give you a story that accords with that feeling. And so you cling to that story as though it's the truth.
Great. So the next, myth is the idea that cynicism is safe, meaning, it protects us from getting burned by other people. So why do people think that cynicism is safe? And again, what's wrong about that belief?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of people don't become cynical because they want to look smart. They become cynical because they've been hurt in the past and they don't want to be hurt again. And I should say at this point, for folks who haven't read the book or know anything about it, that I myself struggle a lot with cynicism. This is where I stand. Part of the reason that I wrote this book is because I needed it. And so I'm not here sort of blaming cynics for the way that they might behave or think, because that's what happened to me, right? I was hurt earlier in my life, and I decided, hey, the only way for me to stay safe is to shut down, to not trust people, to not open up. It's just too scary. And a lot of people feel that way. And so you might imagine that they would think, if I don't trust anybody else, then I certainly won't be betrayed again in the future, which is frankly true. The problem with that is that you also will miss out on opportunities for friendship, collaboration, love. I mean, it's Valentine's Day. You'll miss out on chances for love. And that can be really tragic because those are the things that make life beautiful. Over time, cynics actually end up much less mentally and physically healthy, in part because they deprive themselves of social connection. And social connections are like psychological nourishment. So it's almost like we end up starving. You can think of cynicism as a suit of armor that people put on to protect themselves from what they imagine is a sort of dark version of humanity, but that actually doesn't protect us, but suffocates us instead.
That's really helpful. And so this final, myth that I wanted to talk about is perhaps the kind of most counterintuitive argument of the three, I would say, which is that this is the myth that cynicism is moral. So you kind of bust this myth in the book by arguing that cynicism is not a kind of radical worldview that's sort of speaking truth to power, but rather is actually a kind of tool of the status quo. So could you say a little bit more about this idea that cynicism is moral? And again, why is that misguided? Why is it not this kind of progressive call to action, but rather something that actually ultimately helps the sort of powerful and the privileged?
Yeah, that's right. And again, since publishing this book, and I will add, especially since the election, I've heard a lot from people who say, "How dare you suggest that we hope right now?" Right? This is the wrong time to be talking about hope, and that sounds privileged or even toxic. That in fact, cynicism is the only rational response to injustice and corruption and inequality and bias, all of which are massive and rampant problems. I think the issue is that although cynical people see those problems with deep clarity, they don't envision any solutions, right? I mean, if you think that the most broken parts of our society, things like oppression, things like violence and hatred, if you think that's who we really are deep down, if you think that the worst things that we do are the best evidence about who we are, well, then there's nothing to be done. It's almost like if optimism, burying your head in the sand, thinking that everything is great, if that's a form of light complacency, cynicism is a form of dark complacency, right? Where you figure, well, nothing's going to get better, so why should I bother? And consistent with that, cynical people, compared to non-cynics, actually vote less often. They take part in protests and social movements less often. You can sense this sort of moral exhaustion in them, in that they've lost faith not just in institutions and people in power, but in everything. And as you were saying, David, that actually is frankly helpful to people in power, to people who want to keep things as they are or to consolidate power and do whatever they want. I would say that cynicism is actually a tool of the status quo. If you are an authoritarian, there's very few things that could be better for you than a population that doesn't trust itself.
That's really powerful, and something that you just said there made me wonder about the kind of forms of complacency in both directions. I moved to the United States just over a decade ago from Australia, and one of the differences I noticed between our countries is that often when there's some terrible thing happening in Australian politics or society, people often respond to that by saying, this is who we are. We're a terrible country. We're terrible people. Whereas in the United States, it's often a sort of this is not who we are kind of mentality, and maybe that's changed over time. But what you just said there made me think that there is a kind of complacency in both directions. If you think we're already great. We don't need, there's the risk of saying, well, we don't need to change anything that we're doing because we're already doing great. And then the other risk is of saying, well, we're terrible people and we can never improve our lot. And so we may as well not change as well. So is there some kind of balance here that we need to strike between a kind of overly rosy view of who we are and an overly negative one? Or how would you sort of weigh those two forms of complacency?
Yeah, I think that that's first of all very well put, and it's interesting how much the cynic and the optimist, right, the naive optimist and the gullible cynic, right? I mean, again, not casting aspersions on anyone. I myself often fall into the second category, but it's interesting how much they actually have in common, right? Both of them feel as though they know humanity. Both of them feel as though they know the future, and both of them feel as though they don't need to do much about it because nothing is going to change. Now, I think that one of the ways to strike a balance here, to your question, David, is to let go of certainty and embrace uncertainty, to understand that actually we don't know what everybody is like and we don't know what the future holds. And this is what I would call, in lieu of cynicism or optimism, skepticism, right? So skepticism often confused with cynicism, but it's quite different. Whereas cynics think that they know that people are terrible and look for evidence to confirm that. And trusting people who are naive might think that everybody's great and look for evidence to confirm that. A skeptic acknowledges that they don't know. And instead of having a blanket assumption about what everybody is like, they look for evidence as to who they can trust and who they can't. And likewise, I think a skeptic feels the same way about the future. They don't know what it holds. And so, in that uncertainty, they realize that our actions matter, right? If you don't know what the future holds, then what you do can change the future that we end up inhabiting. And so, skepticism to me and hope as well are a more practical, empowered, and agile way of viewing the world.
That's really helpful. And, I want to pause on, something that you mentioned just before about some of the feedback you're getting about the current environment and how could you not be a cynic? Because I'm hearing that quite a bit right now as well in our work that we do in the center, which is focused on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And a lot of the people in our circles are kind of looking around right now at the sort of vast injustices and inequalities, corruption and greed, and all of the attacks, often malicious attacks on the work that we're doing in this field of DEI. And their kind of cynicism is in many ways getting deepened in this
Mhm.
moment. So taking all of the arguments that you've already raised about, you know, cynicism not being a kind of more moral perspective and the need to cultivate hope and skepticism instead, what should the people who are tuning in today who are feeling cynical right now, who care about these values of diversity, equity, and inclusion, what's a better way for them to channel those feelings into skepticism rather than cynicism?
An easy one, right, David? That's a simple question to answer. Look, I mean, let me just acknowledge what a chaotic and in many ways awful time we're living in. And again, hope is not the same as saying everything is great when it's not. In fact, I think the way that researchers view it is that hope is a response to adversity, right? It's what we do when life isn't the way that we want it. And it includes a few different pieces. One is being able to envision a future that is better. Two is what's known as willpower, or retaining the desire to move towards that future. And the third is way power, that is charting a path from where you are to where you want to be. So these pieces, I hope it's clear, are not the same as ignoring problems. Rather, it's a way to face problems. hope is most useful, for instance, according to research, for people, for instance, who are suffering from chronic illness, or for students from lower SES backgrounds, because it allows them to set goals and move towards them. I think it's also extremely powerful and useful in times of social adversity. So, as you know, David, in my book, I write about Václav Havel, who was a Czech playwright and activist who was there in Prague during the Prague Spring. This was this progressive time when it seemed like Czechoslovakia was going to be democratized and and this progress was occurring. And that movement was crushed by Soviet power, and the entire nation whipped backwards in time and became deeply authoritarian and totalitarian. And Havel was imprisoned. And of course, it would have been very easy for him to justify deep cynicism in that moment. I mean, here was progress, and then it all disappeared. And worse, I mean, the country was it was moving backwards. And he wrote in a series of letters to his wife, what I think is just from prison, this beautiful set of messages about how hope was not something that you could let go of. That in fact, in the hardest moments, it's when it's most important to hold on to hope, and you can't afford to leave it behind because to the point that we were raising earlier, David, that's exactly what will allow authoritarians to triumph. So Havel kept on working from his cell, and then he was freed eventually and rejoined his group of dissidents and ended up, through a long series of protests and social movements, becoming the first democratically elected president of that country. I mean, I don't tell this story to say that everything is going to be great. I have no idea what the future holds. But I think if you look at people like Havel, like Nelson Mandela, like activists throughout history and across the world, they've taken these moments of deep oppression and said, okay, we do not trust or have faith in the country's leadership. We do not have faith in the elites right now. The people we have faith in are our fellow citizens. And we're going to use our hope for something better to locate others who share that desire and to work together to build it. I know that's a little bit of a long answer, David, but I think it's such an important question. And to me, again, I sympathize completely with anybody who feels very cynical right now. And if that's what you need to feel in this moment, it's completely valid. But I think when the time comes that you want to do something and see what change you can make, whether it's something massive or local, that's when you need hope as an energizing force.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. And I think one of the other kind of ways that you talk in the book about making that switch from sort of cynicism to skepticism is I believe you analogize it to thinking less like a lawyer and more like a scientist, which I have to say as a lawyer deeply offended me as I read that. Would love to explain a little bit about, what you mean by that and the sort of form of reasoning and mental model that you're hoping that people will apply.
David, you called me out. I wasn't going to mention that analogy in this particular audience. Look, many of my friends are lawyers. I have deep respect for lawyers of all sorts. But what I meant by that is that, one is a stereotype, likely unfair stereotype of legal thought or legal thinking is that it's advocacy, right? That you begin with a conclusion and then you find evidence to support that conclusion. And this is what we might also call confirmation bias. Thinking, scientists, by the way, also are biased in many cases, but the idealized stereotypical version of a scientist is somebody who they might have a hypothesis, but the point of a hypothesis is that it's just a guess and it's falsifiable, right? And that we don't put our thumbs on the scale in terms of having one conclusion or another. We do science in order to discover what is true. And I see that as a skeptical mindset, right? One where you are curious about what the world holds, what other people are like, as opposed to working from your assumptions. And the data here are pretty clear that most of our assumptions about other people are too negative. For instance, we underestimate how trustworthy people are. We underestimate how open-minded people who we disagree with are. We underestimate the generosity of people around the world. And let me be clear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that there aren't people doing awful things every day. Of course there are. But the average person underestimates the average person. So what that means is that when we pay closer attention, when we take a scientific mindset and try to be open to what people have to offer us, oftentimes we're pleasantly surprised. Oftentimes people end up being better than we think.
So you mentioned the role of social media and cable news. How did can you elaborate a little bit on how social media and cable news affect our levels of cynicism? And for those of us who have social media accounts, are there best practices for how we should engage with the media to point us in the direction of hope rather than cynicism?
Oof. Yeah, I mean, I think it's very clear at this point that social media in particular is generated not to make people informed or healthy or connected, but rather to hook them, for lack of a better term, right? To keep them online for as long as possible. And it turns out that the most efficient way to do that, almost like, for a casino, the most efficient way to keep you at a slot machine is to have it pay out intermittently and unpredictably. Well, for social media, the most efficient way to keep people online is not to show them the best of humanity, but to show them the worst, right? There's evidence that people click more on negative headlines than positive headlines. They focus more on posts, social media posts that are toxic versus non-toxic. And so algorithmically, we are fed a disproportionate amount of whatever we pay attention to. And we pay a lot of attention to negative stuff because we feel like it's a threat and we need to be vigilant to threats in our environment. And so because of that, when you go online, you are systematically being given a funhouse mirror version of social reality. It's a very unfun funhouse mirror, but if a funhouse mirror nonetheless, a distortion. And so in my lab, we found, for instance, that on Reddit, Facebook, Twitter, most toxic posts come from a tiny minority of users. We're talking 3, 8, 5% of users creating the majority of the negative, outrage-filled content that you see. But those people, A, are extremely prolific, and B, are algorithmically boosted. So when you go online, we found in our lab that people imagine that actually 40% of users are toxic. So you end up with this extreme overestimation of how much people hate, how much they loathe one another, how violent they are, how awful they are. And that's helping those companies because it keeps us online and it's not helping us. You asked, what can we do about this? And my honest answer is just use these apps less. But I know that many of us have to use them or want to use them, and that's fine. If you do, I just urge you to be aware of the architecture around you. Be aware of the environment that you've placed yourself in, and be aware that the information you're getting is not objective, but rather a very narrow and specifically chosen slice of humanity that's designed to make you feel a certain way. So the next time you're online and you feel utter distress, you feel like people are just awful, remember that's by design. And maybe you don't need to trust that you don't need to trust that feeling or the data that's producing it.
That's really helpful. And so I want to then turn to how can we help the cynics around us? Because we've talked a bit about how we ourselves can cultivate a mindset of hopeful skepticism. But I'm sure I'm not the only one who has witnessed people in my own life, friends or family members who have gone deeper and deeper into a cynical mindset in recent years, sometimes even as far as embracing full-blown conspiracy theories. So how can we help other people in our lives reduce their own cynicism?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have a couple of thoughts on this. The first is what I might call positive gossip. So it turns out that not only do we pay a lot of attention to negative information, we talk a lot about negative stuff. I mean, I don't know, David, about you, but if I have 10 conversations with people out in San Francisco and 9 of them are relatively positive, and one person treats me sort of like a jerk, I know who I'm going to be talking about at dinner, right? It's probably the most negative interaction that I've had. And it turns out in my lab, we found that people gossip 3 times more about other people's selfish behavior than about their kind and cooperative behavior. And maybe that's an instinct that's there for a reason, but it's not one that we have to carry on. So what I've tried to do is gather one piece of data about people acting in positive ways and then share that in the evening, right? That's something that anybody can do. Basically, try to collect one piece of good data and then share it with your family or friends at dinner or sometime that night. And what I found is that that not only combats cynicism in other people, it also combats it in ourselves. When you realize that you have to talk about something, you look for it more. If I told you, tell a story about something blue that you saw today, you're gonna be looking for the color blue when you're out on the sidewalk. And likewise, when you're looking for goodness, you find it more easily. So that's one thing that I might suggest. The other is to think globally but hope locally, right? The people in our lives who have lost hope, they might be thinking about national or world events that are so large and distressing that it makes us feel helpless. One of the things about hope is that it's focused on agency and what we can accomplish. So, what we can do for ourselves and for others who are despondent or feeling hopeless is to say, well, where could we make a difference today? Where could we make a difference this month? And pointing people towards the space where they have agency and empowerment can naturally get them to think in more hopeful terms.
That's really helpful. Thank you. I now want to sort of pan out to talking a little bit about the point you raised earlier about inequality, because it kind of seemed to me, and yet from your argument in your book as well, that moving from cynicism to skepticism is going to require a lot more than just changing our individual psychological choices, because a lot of the factors that have led to cynicism are structural in nature. So you mentioned inequality as a potential driver of cynicism, with more unequal societies also being less trustful and more cynical. So based on the research that you conducted for your book, what sorts of policy shifts did that research lead you to believe might be necessary to create more durable reductions in cynicism across society?
It's a great question. And, I think that if you look at, if we can start just with the policies that we have now, right? One thing that you see is that a lot of economic policy in the US, for instance, is created with almost palpable cynicism for people who are from lower socioeconomic status backgrounds. So think about sort of public aid programs, right? Social services. These are programs that are supposed to help people in need, but the application processes, the ways, the gauntlet that we make people walk through in order to receive those benefits demonstrates that we don't trust them. This goes back to the racist stereotype of the welfare queen. This was a term coined by Ronald Reagan in the 1970s that sort of describes people who are using any type of public service as sort of taking advantage of others, right? The idea is this deeply mistrustful view of people who have less, which is absolutely misplaced. I mean, there's no evidence for instance, any widespread fraud in terms of people using these social services. But when we use that language, when we point or weaponize our mistrust, we get cover as a society for developing even more inequality. So, from my perspective, one of the sort of policy choices that can combat this is actually to lean in to policies that actually are data driven and support those who have least, the least, right? So, you look at research around the world on direct cash transfers, for instance. These are no strings attached transfers of money to people who are generally lower in socioeconomic status. And if you ask people to predict, for instance, what those folks will do, they predict that, well, poorer people will use that money on, I don't know, drugs, alcohol, cigarettes. They won't use it productively. There's actually a study in Vancouver recently where researchers teamed up with a nonprofit to give $1,000. I think it was $1,000 a month, actually, to unhoused residents of Vancouver. And they asked other Vancouverites, "What do you think these people will do?" And like I'm saying, they said, "Oh, they're going to waste the money on these quote unquote temptation goods." Instead, what these unhoused folks did was use these funds to become stable, to rent apartments, to find work. And in fact, the cash transfers ended up saving the city of Vancouver money instead of costing them. So a lot of these policies are economically efficient. I would say that they're, from my perspective, morally quite powerful and positive. But more than anything, they give trust to people who rarely receive it, who are those who have less. And those people often step up and meet that trust. Oftentimes, when we trust individuals or groups, they respond reciprocally by earning that trust. And that's exactly what happened here.
That's really valuable. Thank you. So I want to just remind everyone that we're going to open up for Q&A shortly. So please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions that you might want to have answered. And while I wait for more folks to do that, I want to also pan out a little bit to think about how cynicism operates, not just at a societal level or at an individual level, but in the kind of in-between space within institutions. So particularly within, say, companies or other hierarchical organizations where managers treat workers as selfish and untrustworthy. So how would you kind of describe what a cynical approach to leadership looks like in an organization? And then what does anti-cynical leadership look like?
Oh, this is a great question. So, yeah, I do a lot of work with organizations to sort of diagnose and combat cynicism. And oftentimes it occurs in really subtle ways. Leaders don't realize that they're being cynical, but like this idea of safety, right? They decide, well, I just need to protect myself from people, I don't know, taking advantage or sort of mooching, right? Or sort of stealing resources. So one example of this that I love came from, I'm from Boston, and around the year 2000, there was a new fire chief who took over the Boston Fire Department, and he audited the workforce. Now, at that time, firefighters could take unlimited sick days because of how dangerous their work was. And the new chief noticed that firefighters were taking more sick days on Mondays and especially Fridays than any other day of the week. And he decided, aha, they're cheating and it's not going to happen on my watch. So he capped sick days at 15 per year, said you're going to lose pay if you take more. He also told injured firefighters that they would have to go before a medical tribunal to prove they weren't faking. Now, he was trying to protect himself, right? And to protect, I suppose, the city from cheating firefighters. But what do you think happened, David, to the number of sick days firefighters took as a result of this new policy? It increased. It more than doubled. And in fact, the number of firefighters who took exactly 15 sick days increased by 1,000%. And interviews with the Boston Globe later found that most of these firefighters would take far fewer than 15 sick days. They were honorable people risking their lives for their communities. And really, there might have been a tiny percentage, just like the toxic people online, maybe 3, 5% who were cheating the system. But when you build policies, either as a government or as a leader at a company that target just those people, but apply to everybody, what you're doing is betraying 95, 97% of the people on your workforce. And people are a reciprocal species. So when we are treated as though we can be trusted, we step up and earn that trust. When we are treated as though we are selfish malingerers, we earn that too, right? We become the worst versions of ourselves. So I think that cynical leadership often takes the form of treating everybody at your workplace as though they are the person you fear, the person who's trying to get away with something. Anti-cynical leadership, by contrast, means treating people like the folks you hope they are. And that could mean, for instance, loosening the reins on people, not micromanaging them, giving them freedom to accomplish their goals in their own time, right? And generally empowering them. And if you want to add even more to that, I would say trust loudly. Tell the people in your organization, I'm giving you this responsibility because I believe in you, because I know that you'll do right by me. When you use those tactics, you can transform these kind of vicious cycles of cynicism at work into virtuous cycles of trust and connection.
So I want to close with, one more question before we dig into the audience Q&A, which is about the way that cynicism fuels political conflict and polarization. So you talk about that, but then you also express some doubt about the alternatives to cynicism, which are, hope, empathy, peace. So here's a quote from your book. Some forms of peace look a lot like the status quo. Researchers find that when people in historically less powerful groups, for instance, Black Americans, desire harmony with more powerful groups, they are less likely to challenge injustice, bias, and abuse. So I'm curious where you kind of land on this topic. How does someone simultaneously maintain the kind of righteous indignation that they might need to fight injustice in the world while also being hopeful and empathetic toward their political opponents?
This is a great question. And here again, I want to draw a pretty sharp distinction between what we might call elites and the people in government, policymakers, and the average person we disagree with, right? So, in many cases, cynicism means that we are very wrong about the average person we disagree with. Research from my lab and others finds that people, if it's both Democrats and Republicans who are asked, what's the average person you disagree with like? They imagine somebody who is much more extreme than the actual average person they disagree with, twice as hateful, twice as anti-democratic, and four times as violent. So we have this image of the other side that almost forecloses on any type of empathy, any type of connection. And again, I think that's actually quite useful for politicians and other, and other elites because again, a population that can't find any common ground is easier to control. So I do think that conversations across difference with everyday people we disagree with can be really powerful as an antidote to that cynicism. But I don't mean to imply that those conversations should cause us to abandon our own views and values. And I really do think that talking with people who are different from us is often confused with agreeing with them. But empathy is not the same as agreement. In fact, I think that compassionate and open-minded conversations can often help us become stronger advocates for our own values by helping us understand how other people see the world. That doesn't mean condoning them. It doesn't mean giving up the fight. But I think that one of the things I would suggest is to again draw this line that if we think a policy is unjust, if we think that there is oppression coming from the top, that we be very fierce about that, but that we also open whatever movements we are part of, even to people who might be different from us on the surface. Because when you go below the surface, sure, some of those people might really disagree with us and hold values that are totally different from ours. But under the surface, I think you might be surprised that folks who don't immediately seem like they're from your political group might actually have a lot more in common with you at a deeper level.
So on that note, I'd love to draw in some audience questions, and please continue to type questions into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So we have a question from someone. If you notice that someone you love is becoming too cynical, how do you talk to them about it?
It's a great question. I think that the first thing I would say is never meet cynicism with cynicism. Oftentimes, cynical people will present as judgmental and mean-spirited. And, when we have the energy, I think it's worth being curious and asking more questions. Oftentimes, we want to go into debate club mode where we just convince somebody, hey, you need to stop thinking this way. It's hurting you, or people are better than you think. Um, but people can tell when we're trying to convince them of something, and they tend to not like it, and they tend to raise their walls higher, not bring them down. A different mode you can go into is interview mode, right? Try to think like a journalist. Ask this person, well, why are you feeling this way? Tell me more about what's going on with you. And then, one tool from what psychologists call motivational interviewing is to ask, well, what do you want? How would you want to feel? What could help you feel differently, right? This is also where thinking globally and hoping locally come in. If you can find a place where this person can feel empowered, can feel like they're moving towards something in their life or a contribution that they want to make, then I think that opens the door for maybe not immediately, zapping them out of cynicism, but helping them imagine something better.
Great. So we have a question about gossip. You sort of talked about positive gossip. And someone asks, how do you balance the idea of negative gossip with studies showing that gossip can lead to bonding between people and thus perhaps help them feel less alone? and that there is hope. It seems ironic. So I guess they're getting at, is there actual value to some extent in people getting together and engaging in that kind of negative gossip with one another, or do you feel like we need to shift entirely over to the more positive forms of
Oh
gossip?
man, I love this question. I could talk about gossip all day. So Robin Dunbar is the person who's studied the sort of social value of gossip in bonding people. There are other people who find that negative gossip is really useful in protecting communities, right? It's a way of spreading information about threats. And so actually, if you look at it, the people who gossip negatively are often very pro-social. They really care a lot about their community. They're not gossiping to score points or to get clout or whatever the kids would call it. They're gossiping to try to help people. The problem is that when we gossip in that way, we end up giving people the wrong idea of who's in the community, right? So one thing that I would say in response to this great question is that gossip, yes, it can bond us to one another, but it doesn't have to be negative to bond us to one another. Gossip is any conversation that two people have that relates to a third person or anybody else, right? So you can spread positive information about other people, and that can be just as powerful a bonding experience. I think that there are places for negative gossip. Of course, if I have a plumber come to my house, David, and they break open my pipes, and then you're saying, "Hey, do you have a plumber that you could recommend?" I'd say, "No, but I have one I definitely want you to not work with," right? And that would be a way of helping you. So I'm not saying that we need to eliminate negative gossip from our lives, but rather to ask the question, can we balance it? Just the same way as we're trying to think in a scientific and curious way, can we give people information that is as fair-minded and accurate as we can? And I think that means both negative and positive information.
Great. So I want to give you another chance to bash the legal profession.
Oh no.
Not really, but there's a question here about someone has said, I seem to recall studies indicating that people who self-select to become attorneys rank high when tested for cynicism, and that law school and the practice of law often heighten or exacerbate that trait. So I'm curious if that is your understanding, first of all, and then um, to what extent do you think then that the legal field, whether it's, law schools, law firms, or what have you, would benefit from certain forms of training to perhaps mitigate cynicism within our own profession?
Yeah, so okay, so there is some evidence for what this person is referring to, but let me defend the legal profession by saying that law is not the only field that seems to increase people's cynicism. One that's much more famous in this regard than law is economics. So it turns out that when students in university begin studying economics compared to students who begin studying other fields, when they declare their majors, economists or economics majors are just as trusting and open-minded and generous as anybody else. But when they graduate with a degree in economics, those students are more cynical, less trusting, and actually act in slightly more selfish ways as well. So there's a sense that, I mean, in economics, we study this model of humanity called Homo economicus, right? The idea that people are rational self-maximizers, that they're really only out for themselves. And if you learn that model and breathe it day in and day out through your classes, guess what? You end up believing it and acting it out. And so I think there's a number of professions where maybe we are taught that life is zero sum. I mean, in at least some legal contexts, outcomes are fundamentally zero sum. One person wins a case, the other person loses it. That those mindsets can work their way into our general views of humanity. And I do think that those are great opportunities to work with folks and say, yeah, we do have parts of our lives, parts of our work that are zero sum, but can we focus on the positive sum outcomes in our lives, in our workplaces as well?
Yeah, and related to that sort of question about training, there's another question about, can hope be taught as a skill? And I thought that was a really interesting question, because I sort of wonder the same thing around, is this a kind of mental exercise that we sort of do as we're just sort of waking up each day, or is there some actual systematic way that you might be able to educate people with the skill of becoming more hopeful in their lives?
This is a terrific question, and the answer is a clear yes, that hope is a skill. So there's a bunch of research now focused on hope interventions. especially for people facing adversity, right? So I think I mentioned this earlier, but two groups of people that have been studied in this intervention work are folks with chronic illness and students from underprivileged backgrounds. And in both cases, these hope interventions allow folks not to just immediately feel better and solve all their problems, but to feel more empowered and therefore to sort of fight with more urgency towards their goals. And so in Hope for Cynics, I have an appendix in the back of the book that is a practical guide that walks people through some techniques that they can use to bolster their own hope. But to sort of give a Cliff Notes version, really what this boils down to is being very clear and systematic about what your goals are, understanding why you want to achieve those goals, and then thinking about how you can, right? So it's a process of, it's I, one thing that's related to this actually is the less scientific, in my opinion, construct of manifesting, right? I mean, manifesting is the idea of imagine something that you want, and really hope is partially that, but then it's also more practically coming up with a plan to achieve it.
Great. So is there any research that looks into, this is another question, is there any research that looks into cynicism and generations? For example, do we have more cynics in younger generations?
Absolutely, we do. Yes. Research suggests that Gen Z is the least trusting that we've recorded since we've been collecting data on what is known as social trust. And it's people are of course wondering why that is. And I think it's very easy to say it's the phones, but I think that we should also think about what different generations are told. I mean, when I was growing up in the 1980s, there were, every milk carton would have a picture of kidnapped children on it, and there was this sense that parenting changed. Parents went from trusting their kids to play outside and sort of spend time on their own to really watching out for them and almost uh, giving them this sense that the world is a very threatening place. In fact, Jer Clifton, a great researcher at the University of Pennsylvania, has found that parents believe that their kids will succeed more if they think the world is dangerous and competitive. The truth is the exact opposite, that people are more successful in terms of their health and professions if they think the world is generally safe and cooperative. But parents, in order to try to make their kids safer, are convincing their kids that the world is very dangerous. And that actually might be shrinking younger generations' willingness to put themselves out there, to trust others in a way that might damage them instead of helping them.
So another question is about the research you've cited. The research you have cited has been really helpful. As you were researching your book, were there other studies or findings that you found particularly hopeful that perhaps you turn to when you're feeling cynical?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. There's so much in the book that brought me hope. I think so. I'll mention a couple of things. One is this idea of conversations across difference. So, I think that so many of us, especially in this hyper polarized political climate, have just foreclosed on the idea of connecting with people we disagree with. So, in my lab, we brought people together for Zoom conversations. So, Republicans and Democrats for conversations about gun control, abortion, and climate change. Breezy stuff, David. No, no problem, right? No, I mean, and we asked these people beforehand, what do you think these conversations will feel like? On a scale of one, the worst conversation you can imagine, to 100, the best. And people told us that they thought it would be pretty awful and that they believed they would like the person less after the conversation and that they would like the entire outgroup less after the conversation. And then we brought them together and they had these conversations. Oh, by the way, we as scientists also thought these conversations would go badly. We trained a group of moderators to step in, not if, but when people started threatening each other and swearing at each other and doxing each other, whatever. And we predicted that 25% of these conversations would have to be stopped for incivility. And instead, none of them had to be stopped. And afterwards, we asked people, how pleasant was that conversation on that same 1 to 100 scale? And the most common response we got was a 100 out of 100. People were shocked at how positive these conversations were and how much common ground they could find because again, we're inundated with media representations of the other side. And when we actually talk to a human being on the other side, people actually are willing to be open-minded, are willing to share their perspectives, and are willing to connect. And so that's one piece of evidence that I think made me more hopeful about something that really I feel very little hope about most of the time, which is our ability to connect.
Great. We have another couple of questions about, is there any way to test your own cynicism levels? Is there a kind of cynicism scale quiz that people can take to figure out how cynical they are?
There is. So I actually worked with the Times of London on a cynicism quiz, and on my website, if you go to the media page of my website, you can find that Times of London article and take the test yourself, and you can sort of self-assess your own cynicism. And please, I will just add, do not feel any shame if you are cynical. Many of us are. This is nothing to be ashamed of, but rather something to just acknowledge and work with however you want.
Another question is about how do you see hope as being the same or different from faith in a religious or spiritual context?
Oh, I love that question. I love that question. So I think that both hope and faith share something really beautiful, which is a sense that the world is much bigger than us, and that and that actually we don't know what the future holds, and we kind of have to give away that sense of control, right? I mean, whether in hope it's sort of acknowledgement that the future is unknown, and I think with faith it's the idea that God and the universe are full of mystery. But in both cases, we acknowledge that there something good could happen, right? And we try to imbue that future with meaning. So it's sort of letting go of power and control and yet remaining open to what the world gives us. I think that those are two common features of hope and faith. Actually, I've not thought very much about this, but I hope that that hope that that sort of riff is useful. I think it's a really beautiful question.
So we only have, a couple of minutes left. So I want to close on this question, which is a very broad one, where someone asks, what does it look like to feel hopeful in the current moment? What is your hope for the United States?
Wow. I think that hope in the current moment is very fraught because there's a lot to not feel hopeful about. There's a lot that's very frightening and really outrageous that's occurring now. So I'll just speak personally, if that's okay, David. For
Yes.
me, I don't feel particularly optimistic about what will happen in the coming weeks, months, and years. But I do feel quite hopeful because I've seen people in my community and in communities around the world uh, activate, right? I think that, and again, I don't want to sort of talk in very partisan terms, but I think that the election was just so chaotic and so polarizing and so distressing for many people that I think that it just collapsed us. I think many people just had to remove themselves from public life for a while. But I see people re-energizing. I see them coming back, and I see them ready to struggle for what they believe in. And so I don't, for myself, locate hope in the government, for instance, right now at this moment. I locate hope in my communities, whether that's my academic community, my family community, my sort of local communities, and so I think that that's where I find it, not in what's above us, but in what's all around us, which to me remains an ocean of very good people who want things to be better.
Well, I think that's a lovely place for us to close. So thank you so much, Jamil, for joining us today. It's been a wonderful and dare I say hopeful conversation, certainly for me, and I hope for everyone in the room today as well. So thank you again for your time and we're adjourned, everybody. Take care.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you, everybody, for being here.